All right. Good morning, Buckeyes. Let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully, you are all doing well. Making your way through the last week of classes. It's hard to believe we finally made it to this point, but I think in our case, we definitely saved the best for last. So I'm definitely excited about that. We have a lot to work on this week in terms of talking about aggression, antisocial behavior. So we'll spend about a day on that. And then closing out class with talking about pro-social behavior. So we spent a lot of time on stereotyping and prejudice, but I think there's a lot to that. I think it's important for us to understand those concepts well. And again, I teach a whole class on that. So that's why we're a little truncated on aggression and pro-social behavior, but I think you guys will understand the concepts quickly. I think you'll be able to process it well. So I think it was a good trade-off. So to make sure that we're set with how we're moving forward with things, let me take care of a couple announcements, check in with you guys, make sure we're all good, and then we're just going to get after it today. And that'll be the same case for Thursday as well. Again, processing lots of good information, really staying on top of things. So a couple of reminder announcements. These are to help us kind of think about what we're going to be doing as we wrap up the class, kind of deadlines, things like that. So the first of these announcements is that the last two writing assignments are due before class on April 23rd, so this Thursday. So next time I see you guys on Thursday morning, you want to make sure that you get these turned in. Hopefully you guys have gotten a chance to work on them a little bit. Hopefully they're good, fun assignments for you. Get a little bit of processing in the first one with assignment number 4, talking about stereotyping and prejudice, applying it to COVID virus. And then the last one's kind of just give you a chance to kind of reflect back on the class. It's been a class that has kind of multiple different pieces, lots of things that we've been working on. So I want to always give students kind of a chance to work with that. So that's going to be due this Thursday. Let me know if you have any questions as you're working on it, any kind of issues that might arise as you're trying to get things uploaded. I know there's a few issues we work through. I appreciate those of you letting me know. I also want to remind you guys to take a moment to complete SEIs for this class and for other classes. I always look at those. I always give careful attention to them. The SEIs are especially important to give a little bit of feedback on how the online portion of the class went. So please take some time to do that. I always want to make sure I get as many responses as possible so I can really understand how the classes overall felt. If I only get a handful of responses, just like with any class, it's kind of hard to know what went well, what didn't go well, because there's so few voices. That's why with research, we always want to get as many participants as we can. So please take some time to do that. I believe they close towards the end of this week. I know that they close definitely before finals begin. So spend a little bit of time with that if you can for me, please. I'd super appreciate it. I did send out an extra credit opportunity email yesterday. Basically what I did is I sent out a link to a short survey study, short research study. If you have a moment, you're willing to do that, that'd be great. It's worth 5 points of extra credit, so I'll award that to you just straight away at the end. It is due April 30th at 9 o'clock, so that's the eve of when our final is technically due. So that's that Thursday of finals week. So if you can take a moment to do that, I will ask you for your name at the end of the study. That's just for extra credit purposes. I won't look at your data specifically or anything like that. If you do feel uncomfortable with it, you can email me to say that you did it instead. We can do something like that. But hopefully you guys get a chance to kind of participate in that. It's kind of a short, easygoing study. Continuing kind of along with the last pieces to talk about here. Exam number 4 answer sheet is due on Carmen on May 31st at 9:35. So if we were taking the last exam in the classroom, that's when the exam would be due by. So that's hence why we have that specific time. Again, I'll release the exam about 24 hours before the due date. We'll do the same kind of thing. Thursday morning in this case, I'll get it released to you guys. You have about 24 hours. You can download it, work with it. All you have to do is upload your answer sheet to me. You don't need to send anything else in, so hopefully that makes it easy. If you don't have good internet connection or traveling or working or something like that, that you can work through that. If there are issues, please let me know right away, and I'm happy to kind of help you guys out, work with it. And like I did last time, I'll be in our Zoom classroom I'll be in our Zoom classroom during the exam time. So if you have any questions as you're wrapping up the exam that you want to ask me, and you want to be able to interact with me, I'll be there to answer any of those questions. I'm happy to answer them over email as well if you're working on them prior to that time, but just so you guys are sure to have some time to connect with me if you have questions. Just want to make sure that you guys have that. So lots of kind of information as we focus on wrapping up the class. We take care of the last pieces here. I'm going to pause here, see if any questions. You can ask it again over video. If you do have video, please turn it on. That's great. It's always really nice to see you guys. As you can see, we have our camping theme going on today. I sent out a camping noise link. I thought that'd be kind of fun. camping is one of my favorite things to do. In fact, we're already kind of planning our camping trips and getting the camping tent out, at least in the backyard for a little bit here. Evie has her tent out in the house, so she likes hiding and playing in there. So I thought we'd do something like that. In case you're wondering, for Thursday, the theme is going to be going to the beach, which I think is pretty appropriate for the last day of class. So, get your beach situation ready to go for the last class. So, any kind of questions, things I can answer. Again, if you have a camera, please turn it on. It's great to see you guys. It helps me kind of see how things are going with getting lecture notes recorded and the pace of things as well. So, I'll actually pause at this point to see if you have any questions. Again, you can let me know over chat as well. All right, guys, so let's pick up where we left off in terms of talking about what aggression is. We'll review this just a little bit. You had a little bit of a homework assignment, so hopefully you remember to do that. If not, you can quickly pull it together this morning, I'm pretty sure. So we talked about aggression. We talked about it as this kind of being this concept that's hard to define. And it's hard to define because every definition that's kind of been put forth always has some kind of limitation to it, something that isn't quite sitting well with how we want to think about our behaviors. So we talked about initial definition of aggression being any behavior intended to harm another person who's motivated to avoid that harm. And in short, this is the definition I tend to use, but I also am aware that there's problems with this definition. Okay, so we know that sometimes we can harm someone without meaning to. Okay, so maybe we say something, maybe it's negative, but it's not designed to harm someone. Maybe it's just an accident, especially if a car accident, someone might be injured, you didn't intend to. Or in fact, you can have almost the opposite happen where you intend to harm someone, but somehow that person is not harmed. Okay, so maybe you did mean to say something mean, but that person kind of brushes it off, or they're not really realizing what the situation is. And so we can see that in some cases that intent to harm someone doesn't really play out. We can think about aggression as kind of more of a broad stroke in terms of antisocial behavior, that it's behavior that either damages interpersonal relationships or is culturally undesirable. So this idea that it's going to harm some relationship that you have with someone else, or if it doesn't necessarily harm that relationship, maybe because it's the relationship is resilient to what's going on, maybe it's culturally undesirable. You don't want people acting that particular way. And so this is something where you have to be a little mindful of how we think about aggression, how we use that terminology, kind of think about how social psychologists use it versus individuals who are not social psychologists, who might say things like, the sales tactic was aggressive, or the person was aggressive in line, where they're not necessarily talking about aggression, but maybe a little more of this kind of being upfront or forward. And that's a different way we think about aggression than how people sometimes use that terminology. Now, one of the other pieces we talked about with our working definitions of aggression was the different types of aggression. So direct aggression, indirect aggression, instrumental, and hostile. So direct aggression, meaning the victim is present, you're directly harming them. Indirect, meaning that the victim isn't present, okay, but somehow that person's being harmed. Instrumental aggression is focused on a means towards an end, whereas hostile aggression may be desired to kind of hurt someone kind of impulsively. And we can see that these cross over. It might be direct aggression that's instrumental, so you're directly harming the victim, but it's a means to an end. So one of the homework assignments I gave you guys is, as you're watching TV, as you're watching shows, to identify some of these forms of aggression. So I'll give you two examples from the movie Thor. So I told you guys, I believe that as part of kind of our staying at home, we decided to watch all the Marvel movies in order. So as they came out, something we had never done before. We're watching them a little out of order because we watched the last two first, and then now we decided to do this whole stretch. So we watched Thor on Friday night, I think it was, and there was two different forms of aggression that I noted in there. One was instrumental aggression. So at one point, towards the end of the movie, the big robot alien thing is taking over this little town in the middle of nowhere. One of the soldiers jumps on the robot and starts kind of distracting it. And it starts being aggressive towards it, so that then Lady Sith can come in and kill the robot. Okay, I'm sure there's more technical names for all these things. I apologize to the Marvel fans out there who are just cringing as I'm horribly describing the scene. Okay? To some degree, we can argue that the initial act of aggression was instrumental aggression. Okay, so it was a means to an end. He was aggressing against the robot as a robot alien as a way to kind of set up this means to an end that then Lady Sith would kill the robot, make the robot go away, or at least temporarily, it seemed like. Okay. We also saw in that movie that there was indirect aggression. So Loki was, harming Thor by saying kind of lies to his family when Thor wasn't present, when Thor was on Earth. And so that was some aggression that we saw there in terms of it harmed Thor. Okay? It harmed his relationship, kept him out of from being home. So you can see that that's would be an example of indirect aggression. Okay, so hopefully you guys are getting the idea behind the examples, even if I'm describing them in terms of Marvel language horribly wrong. But I'm going to pose to you guys, what are some examples from kind of TV shows, movies, of direct, indirect, instrumental, hostile aggression? Again, these can be crossed over with each other, but let's get a few examples to get us thinking about things, get us getting going a little bit this morning. And bonus points if you can use Marvel movies and actually describe them correctly.
I've actually never seen the Marvel movies, but I don't know if anybody.
Well, thank you for saving me, because at least if I described them badly, at least I've seen them. Sorry, Cassie, couldn't help it.
I don't know if anybody has watched Ozark on Netflix. If you haven't, it's a 10 out of 10. And I guess I can't really say much about it because I don't want to ruin it for anybody.
Yeah, please don't, because that's actually on my list of summer shows if I have some time.
Oh, well, it's amazing. But there's like a lot of aggression in that. I'm trying to like not say names, but like direct aggression. The last episode I watched, someone got hit by by a car on a bike.
Uh-huh.
And it was like on purpose.
Okay.
And then there's a lot of indirect aggression in it too, like a lot of like rumors and stuff that go around between the characters and like affect everybody else even if they're not around.
Okay.
And there's a lot of stuff going on that like one person doesn't know about. So I guess that's a really vague example, but
well, that's okay. You're saving us from spoiling the show, but I think you've tapped into that direct aggression where you're literally hitting someone. And I think you gave a great example of indirect aggression, especially rumors. Rumors are kind of the classic example of this indirect aggression where, the rumors are being spread about someone who's not oftentimes present. And that can be problematic in its own right. Okay, so I think those are great examples, even if you're trying to save us from learning too much about the show. Okay. Other examples.
So my boyfriend and I, we just watched Spider-Man Far From Home.
Okay, yeah, that's on our list. We haven't watched the Spider-Mans, but
well, I'll try not to spoil anything, but the character that you think is good in the beginning ends up being not so good.
Okay.
And so throughout the movie, he kind of starts to show why he's doing what he's doing, and then also saying he wants to kill people. So that's definitely hostile.
Okay. All right.
And then towards the end, it would be direct aggression because the victim is definitely present. Whereas in the beginning, you didn't know who would be the victim. Okay.
All right. So great kind of examples working through that. Points for Marvel movie again. So, we see that, it starts to be more that direct aggression. So you see that it's kind of being very classic in Marvel movies. The direct aggression kind of picks up towards the end versus kind of in the process of the movie, it might be more instrumental. It might be more indirect as it kind of goes along. Sounds like maybe that was the case for Spider-Man. So you can see, again, you can identify those pieces in these movies. And it's good to go to TV shows, movies, and music to kind of pull from examples because they really reflect what's going on around us. Okay? Other examples you guys can think of any of these forms of aggression. And we'll actually get into talking about media and aggression here, hopefully before the morning's out.
I started watching, my brother just got Disney Plus, so I started watching like old Disney shows.
Okay.
And so I watched this episode of Sweet Life and Zach and Cody, and Cody wants to run for president, but Zach also wants to run for president, so Zach kind of spreads rumors about Cody, so it's indirect because he's not really there during the present. He posts baby pictures of him or little pictures or a picture of him where he looks scared. And he's
okay.
Do you think you want that as president?
Okay.
Someone who's scared. And then so it's just indirect and it's instrumental since Zach also wants to be president. He thinks that's the only way to be president.
So I love that example. I appreciate you sharing it. We're picking at Disney this morning, Disney in some form or another. So I love that one because it talks about kind of this crossover between it being indirect and instrumental. So it's instrumental to the end of trying to win the election. It's indirect in the fact that you're, again, spreading those rumors, kind of being that classic example of indirect aggression. That victim isn't, present. They're being kind of shared that information behind their back. But it's all working towards a means to an end. And you guys, as we watch political campaigns, you can see this form of aggression come out as it's kind of this instrumental aggression, oftentimes it's indirect aggression. Okay, so some really wonderful examples this morning. I appreciate it. You guys did your homework well. Okay. Other examples or other questions?
Over the weekend, we watched the movie Resistance, which is about like Nazi Germany and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And so obviously like there's hostility because like they're just killing just to kill basically. And then also kind of like instrumental because like there's a means to an end of like the Jew population as well, like within like throughout the entire movie.
And I think that's a good one for us to process, especially in terms of kind of this larger context going back to day one of social psychology, is that so much of social psychology developed from trying to understand why Nazi soldiers were doing this to innocent Jews. And so some of it, was that instrumental aggression towards a larger kind of cleansing, at least in terms of what the thinking was. Some of it did, I'm sure, start to become kind of this hostile aggression, potentially hostile in terms of soldiers, feeling that that's the way they had to operate because they were following orders. And so I think that's another great example. And again, as you go about your day, as you process different information, as you watch TV shows, things like that, pull some of these examples. It's a good way to kind of keep social psychology in mind as you're going through it. When I was taking qualifying exams in graduate school, I sat down one night and I just wanted to mindlessly watch Big Bang Theory, and I spent the whole time breaking down the whole show based on this theory and that theory. It was eventually just gave up and turned it off and went to bed because I was still kind of processing TV shows and things around me in the social psychology way. And I don't want you guys to get to that level of things, but at the same time too, see how the things we talk about get tied to everyday experiences. Okay? And so you guys have gave lots of great examples in terms of media where there's aggression. Again, we'll talk about this, but one of the tricks becomes important for social psychologists is to try to measure aggression in the lab. So we know that we want to have a controlled environment so that we can rule out all the other factors, see only the factor we're interested in and how it's affecting the result, in this case, aggression. So one of the other tasks I gave you guys for homework was, how do you think we could measure aggression in the lab? So if you're designing a study, if you're thinking about past studies that measured aggression, what were some of the means that they used, or what were some means that you could imagine researchers would use to study aggression?
Maybe like putting somebody in a situation where like they would get frustrated and then compare the behavior of somebody else who wasn't in that situation. Or maybe like if somebody was in a situation where they would be like aggressive or frustrated, like see how they react in another situation, like maybe with other people or something like that.
Okay, so we could create some type of frustration. We'll talk about frustration leading to aggression and theories related to that. And we create scenarios where they're given opportunity to aggress against someone else. Okay, but potentially the person that frustrated them, potentially someone who didn't necessarily frustrate them, but they're in that frustrated state. Okay? So thinking about that could be one way that we could set it up. What could be some ways that we could measure this aggression? So let's say we do create frustration for someone, how can we measure them aggressing against someone else?
Could you measure like someone's heart rate while they do that?
Measure, I'm sorry, what was that, please?
No, you're fine. Could you measure their heart rate?
Okay, all right. So great example, great idea. You can measure physiological responses that are associated with aggression, so heart rate. Okay, so talk about this as well as terms of sweating, so kind of galvanic skin response. So absolutely, you could look at physiological characteristics that are associated with aggression. Okay, so great suggestion, Morgan. Okay. Other potential ways that we can measure aggression.
Maybe like in that one study that we watched like a couple weeks ago, like where they were like being shocked and like kind of seeing like after the fact, like how maybe aggressive they were like in the same situation that's like wasn't being shocked.
Okay, so another great suggestion. In fact, that's a very common measure of aggression is actually to have participants believe that they're administering shocks to others. They have definitely modified this so it's nowhere near the Milgram experiment, which I think is what you're referencing, but they're giving kind of smaller shocks that are uncomfortable. They'll look at the intensity of them, the duration of them. We'll see some variation of that as well. Okay, and sometimes they'll have participants give shocks to avatars as well. Okay, so it's not actually another person receiving it. Another example, another thought that you could have in terms of how we can measure aggression in the lab. Okay, so help you guys out, because this has really been the challenge for social psychologists is how do we measure aggression in the lab? How do we capture this behavior? And we're going to see that there's several different ways of doing it, one of which you guys covered already in terms of talking about shocks. So participants believe that they're giving shocks to someone else. They might start off the experiment receiving a little bit of a shock themselves to know what that shock is like, and then they are given a task where they're able to administer shocks. Maybe they've been frustrated. They'll usually couch this within a game, so that they'll say that you're competing with someone else and the loser receives a shock that the winner gets to give. And so that's the context they give for why they can administer these shocks. They do the same thing for noise blasts as well. Noise blasts, while maybe less physiologically harmful, are really still awful. So noise blasts usually consist of kind of a loud, irritating sound, nails over the chalkboard, screeching sounds. I used to play this noise blast in class, and it was just so aversive I couldn't do it. So I'm going to spare you guys from it, but if you ever look up noise blasts online, if you ever want to know what it's like, it's really unpleasant. But again, they can look at this in terms of the duration of it, the intensity of it, so how loud it is. And they again can couch this, I should say, within this kind of game that they're playing. They look at negative evaluations. So sometimes experiments are set up so that participants receive positive or negative feedback from someone else. They then can give evaluations to that person. And usually these evaluations are related to getting kind of promotions, being able to get student assistant jobs, things like that. And so they measure how negative the evaluation is. They'll do this with horn honking. So one of the classic studies of this is that they did this where someone a participant got stuck behind a pickup truck at a red light, and they wait to see how long it took for the participant, the person behind the truck, to honk their horn, basically to tell the driver to move faster. And they varied what was in the back of the truck in the gun rack. So either was a gun in the gun rack, so cueing aggression, or a fishing pole. And what they found is that participants were faster to honk the horn when the gun was present compared to the fishing pole. And the argument here is that gun prompts ideas, prompts thoughts of aggression, and so that's why people are faster to honk their horn. Which, if you think about it for 2 seconds, is not the right time to honk your horn, is when someone else has a gun readily available in the back of their car or back of their truck. We'll actually talk about Bobo dolls, so I won't talk about that one. The last one I will talk about, though, is hot sauce allocation. So again, this is idea that you're going to give hot sauce to someone who dislikes hot sauce. And this hot sauce is usually something that's generally unpleasant. So I apologize if I shared this story with you guys before, but in graduate school, a collaborator, a friend of mine, was doing a study that involved hot sauce. And the hot sauce we got was this special hot sauce that we actually shipped in from Australia. My advisor was in Australia for a while, and he remembered this hot sauce. And it was enough that if you put it at the end of a toothpick and you had a little bit of it, it was enough to feel uncomfortable. Okay, so you started kind of sweating. You were really you're really uncomfortable. And this is something that, I, who generally like things, a little bit hotter, was really feeling uncomfortable with. And so, of course, this turned into how much we could take, how much we could stand before we were uncomfortable. We did stupid graduate school things related to this, of course, but one of the things I think stood out the most is that in a rejection paradigm where a participant was rejected from the group, she actually filled a 4-ounce container of this. And so if you take a second to think about this, that 4-ounce container, okay, would be enough to severely hurt someone. Okay, it would definitely be enough to put that person in the emergency room based on how hot just a little bit at the end of a toothpick was. In fact, it would definitely cause permanent injury. I dare say it could potentially cause death or near death, at least the need for surgery, if someone actually had to consume that full amount. That same person also then vandalized several doors, faculty doors, graduate students' doors, and bulletin boards on their way out after they had been debriefed about what's going on. So, one of the things that becomes tricky about these are these valid measures of aggression. So they're really capturing aggression. The other piece that is tricky in a criticism of them is that it's kind of condoned aggression, where you're giving people the opportunity to give noise blasts or shocks to someone else. And that's where it gets a little bit trickier, because we don't usually have situations where it's condoned that we can aggress against someone else. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on kind of 3 different ways to understand aggression. And we're going to work through psychodynamic and sociobiological a little faster. In fact, I'm going to switch it over to just my face and we'll work through it quickly. But then we'll focus a little bit more about the learning theory. So we'll talk about 2-factor theory. Okay, so we're going to talk about that as involving learning. We'll talk about some limitations there. But we'll really focus on these last 2 in this learning category of social learning and the general aggression model. The general aggression model is kind of the benchmark. It's the model that's been most frequently tested recently. So I want to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of perspective on different ways of thinking about aggression. But at the same time, too, we're going to focus on kind of more of this learning theory. And we're going to see why we focus more on this learning theory compared to the others, because it has greater validity, these theories do. And I think you'll see that they're more aligned with how we respond, how we learn about aggression. In fact, a little bit to this a certain degree, how we teach aggression. So let me pause at this point to see if we have any questions, things I can address for you guys before we'll start unpacking these theories. Okay, so this slide kind of is our guide map, our guidepost for where we headed again. We'll go through a little bit quickly psychodynamic and sociobiological, focusing more on these learning theories. All right, so what I want to do is go ahead and we're going to shift it up a little bit, okay? And I'm just going to walk you through these theories. So hopefully you guys have the notes, have the PowerPoint slides for you guys. So let me kind of walk you through the basic understanding of these kind of 2 initial perspectives. So when we talk about these different theories, okay, we'll start first to talk about Freud's psychodynamic perspective. Okay? And his perspective here is that we have 2 inescapable innate drives. So these innate drives, the idea behind them is that we have kind of these motivations, these unconscious processes that guide our behaviors. And in guiding our behaviors, we start to develop these aggressive drives. Okay, so Freud basically said, hey, we have 2 different drives, eros and thanatos. And eros is this drive for love, it's this drive for sex, this connection with others, especially that physical connection. And this promotes, passing on genes, love, social connections with others. And this is a positive drive. But Freud also said, well, hey, we have an aggressive drive. Okay, so he's trying to understand, well, if we have this eros drive to push towards love, be connected with each other, well, why would we do harmful things to each other? Okay, so he's saying, well, hey, there's also this death drive. And remember, Freud's thinking is that really there's this kind of internal conflict that individuals have that they have to resolve. Okay, if they're going to resolve these different drives, this allows them to be successful in terms of who they are, in terms of developing their personality, in terms of navigating things on a daily basis. And where Freud started to process this a bit more is he said, well, society deems some of these urges as unacceptable, so we have to seek some way to express these drives. Okay, so we can't always have sex, we can't be aggressing against towards others, just acting on these basic drives. That superego kicks in and says, hey, this doesn't meet the standards of what we have for society. So the ego has to try to resolve this conflict, resolve this idea that we just want to act on love, or we have this basic death drive that causes us to harm ourselves, potentially harm others. And so he says sex gets then kind of re-represented in terms of being creative in the arts. Okay, so it's a way to socially acceptably demonstrate this love idea. So that's where you see in arts, there's a lot of kind of theme of love and connection with others. So that's his argument of how we demonstrate this drive in a socially acceptable way. In terms of aggression, he again says we have this death drive. This is where we're going to harm each other. But he says, well, we want to demonstrate this in a way that's socially acceptable. We're going to do this through having sports and competition. Okay, so he would argue that boxing then is a way to demonstrate this death drive in a way that's socially acceptable. Okay, so no one's being overly harmed. In fact, we talked about aggression in sports as being rewarded. And again, we'll get into that kind of component of things here. So within this psychodynamic perspective, Freud goes a bit farther and he says, well, there's a little bit of this idea of a hydraulic model. Okay, so we're on slide 9 if you're kind of following along. And the idea here is that this aggressive tendencies, this thanatos drive starts to build up over time, and it has to be released. Okay, so how many of you just had pressure kind of builds, just having a bad day, and at some point you just kind of lose it, just kind of get really aggressive, really kind of upset, things like that. It just kind of happens to all of us. Yeah, raising our hands or kind of nodding along. You know, that's a process that Freud would say is part of this kind of Thanatos drive, this death drive. And he argued that once this aggression starts to build up at some point, you know, you have to release it. Yeah, this is where you get into that, you know, kicking the dog phenomenon. You know, you have to get that aggression out. You know, you're harming, you know, animals in the sense that you're harming those things that aren't necessarily related to where the aggression is being caused. And so one of the catharsis ways that he saw addressing this Thanatos drive is by just simply watching violence. Okay, so this idea here that, hey, if you watch violence, it'll make it go away for you. Okay, you'll stop feeling this aggression drive. That catharsis comes out by having watched this aggression. So now we don't have to, you know, experience that drive any longer. And in fact, researchers have demonstrated, testing this idea, that this catharsis approach doesn't work. Okay, so be careful, because that's still an idea that's out there. It's very prevalent that if you're feeling aggressive, you should just watch aggressive shows, play violent video games. That doesn't work. Data goes against this model. Basically says aggression begets more aggression. Okay, so in many cases, aggression increases emotions and behaviors associated with aggression. So we really see that aggression only leads to more aggression. Okay, so it's not cathartic to start becoming more aggressive towards others. Okay, Bushman would say, Brad Bushman, who studies aggression, would say the best way to relieve aggression is to do something that's completely the opposite. Okay, so you're feeling aggressive, hug a loved one, or, you know, watch something peaceful, or meditate on things. That's the best way to reduce this aggression. So Freud, again, really thinks about aggression as forms of these kind of drives that are competing with each other. You need to resolve these conflicts both in terms of the individual, so how they act on their Eros and Thanatos drive in a socially appropriate way, and this idea of catharsis, that if you just kind of view aggression, that's going to make that aggression go away. And in both cases, we see that the theory doesn't hold quite as well. Okay. Now, a second theory we'll talk about is a sociobiological perspective. Okay, so we're going to work through these, again, just a little bit quickly. We'll come back to things a little slower in terms of talking about the learning theories here. Okay. So Lorenz says, hey, aggression in this case is innate. It's necessary and adaptive. Why would Lorenz make this argument that aggression is innate, necessary, and adaptive? Why does he view aggression as being important for us to demonstrate? Okay, how is this evolutionarily helpful for us to be aggressive? Okay, so I'm looking at it, he's making this argument, becomes kind of the foundation of his biological piece for why we have aggression. Why would we make the argument that, hey, it's good to be aggressive, it's adaptive for us to be aggressive in situations? Why would this be evolutionarily adaptive, that aggression is something that's kind of inherent for us?
I feel like it's like natural to be like competitive and I don't know, like feel that urge. I mean, maybe not necessarily like to like kill somebody or something like that, but okay. I feel like it is normal to like compete and like over anything, like over a job, like over like resources, like, and I feel like when we're like with the examples that we looked at, like over scarce resources, like I feel like aggression definitely increases, and I feel like we can't necessarily help it. And I feel like a lot of times people will look back at a time when they did something like that and be like, wow, like I didn't mean to do that, but like they couldn't control it.
Okay. So you got kind of a couple pieces there. One is that, you know, maybe it is good to be innately aggressive because then allows you to get those scarce resources. Okay, we just got done, I think you alluded to this a little bit, talking about kind of this realistic conflict theory. Once there's limited resources, we start to become aggressive towards others in terms of being prejudiced, towards discriminating that group, that we're competing over those resources. So maybe part of this is simply that it's more successful, you may be more successful if you are more of an aggressive person, kind of getting those things that you want, kind of taking those things away from others. And I think that that's what Lorenzo would kind of argue here, that having a certain degree of aggression, and maybe a higher degree in his argument here, is adaptive because it allows you to get those resources you need in order to be successful. Okay, but if we know if we're too aggressive, though, towards others, that this could run into problems as well, as that individuals don't want to interact with us, okay, so we don't have those connections. And what he argued, thinking on this idea of aggression being innate, necessary, and adaptive, is that there's kind of situational environment cues that interact with this genetic predisposition. Okay, so what he's basically making an argument here is kind of Lewinian in the sense of this kind of person and situation producing this aggression outcome. So the person is innately aggressive. Okay, it's adaptive for them to be aggressive. And there's something within that environment around them that cues that aggression. It says, hey, now is the time for you to be aggressive, that this is where you're going to get the best benefit of this situation. And we'd argue kind of taking this a step further. So looking at slide 11 here, okay, which will be our last piece of the psychobiological, sociobiological and psychodynamic, is that he makes the argument, kind of based on Darwin's theory a little bit here, that genes for aggression are passed along, whereas genes for passivity are not. Okay, so the genes for aggression are shown as being evolutionarily adaptive, so we become more and more aggressive. Okay, and we know that that's not the case. We know that actually become less aggressive as a society. There's less deaths, okay, especially compared to the fact we have greater means of causing death in mass. But he still makes this argument that there's situational or environment cues that interact with our genetic predispositions. Okay, so it causes arousal by hormones so that the situation causes this physiological response. And the key thing for his sociobiological perspective is that the situational cue is hardwired. Okay, so we've developed this trait towards being aggressive, and this trait towards being aggressive gets cued when something is hardwired in us that prompts that response. Okay, so he kind of looks at this as kind of the case of the stickleback fish. And he uses this fish as kind of an argument that in the environment, if a cue is there, a person becomes aggressive. In the case of the fish, what they basically do is they'll attack anything that's red. So basically, they're cued by the environmental factor of seeing something red. Because they've passed along genes that they attack anything that's red, because it's in that situation, they gravitate, they attack that red object. And so we can look at his perspective and say, well, there's bits and pieces of it that we're going to see as being consistent with what we talk about later. Okay, so the environment having an influence on aggression. Okay, genes are always important to consider in terms of personality traits. But we'll also talk about the fact that we don't always have the same trigger. Okay, so someone may be in a situation where aggression occurs. It's not always the case that just because they see aggression, then they suddenly become aggressive. Okay, so I was thinking about this a little bit this morning. You know, it might be a cue that when you see an aggressive situation that you respond with more aggression. That would be kind of Lorenz's perspective, that becomes the natural trigger. You see aggression, become more aggressive. But that wouldn't explain the people that break up the bar fights, you know, the people that, you know, help out someone who's being aggressed against. That doesn't fit with this idea. Okay, so we see that it's not as simple as this, where there's just basically some trigger that causes this aggressive response. So we talked about the psychobiological, or psychodynamic. Sorry, guys, I'm putting the two together this morning. I'll try not to do that quick confusing, guys. So we talked about this psychodynamic with Freud. Okay, so continue his thinking about these inner drives that are in conflict with each other, how we have to resolve these drives. And the sociobiological, okay, which again, this idea that genes are associated with aggression and that different situations produce this arousal, produce this aggression, and these are hardwired. Okay, we find little support for either of these theories in totality, but in bits and pieces, we'll see that they do hold. So before we get into talking about more of the learning theories, which is the current way of thinking about aggression, I want to pause at this point to see what questions you have. Okay, if there's something I can go back through a little bit.